This talk will look at a selection of women in the history of Dacorum and also one or two from the wider Hertfordshire area. The broad categories we'll be looking at will be the general history of the way women were viewed and treated, the criminal justice system of the 18th and 19th centuries, aristocrats and queens, and finally those who fought for equality, like the women's suffrage movement, women in the war, the UK feminist movement of the 60s and 70s, and also a little bit about Dacorum's black women's history. The journey through the story of Dacorum's women through history will be by necessity a patchy one. Contemporary historical records were made primarily by educated wealthy men, who by definition were the only group of those with sufficient literary education to do so. Women and the poor had little agency on what was recorded, at least until the 20th century, and therefore their story is often missing. The rare occasion where women of note recorded their own story, they tended to live and operate in London, which will fall out of the boundaries of this talk. One place where women's stories were told was the criminal justice system, through the records of the crimes they were accused of and the punishments they received. Royal women and aristocrats sometimes appeared in contemporary records as well. Women were considered the property of their husband or fathers, and it was accepted and even expected that men would use force and discipline to keep their wives and household in order. In the 1760s, there was a term called femme covert, which meant that married women had no identity. This did have the advantage of keeping them out of the court for minor crimes, as their husbands were held accountable for them. Women were considered weaker and feeble in mind and body. Victorian women's crimes were medically diagnosed. For example, kleptomania was used rather than a thief. Some crimes, though, were gendered in themselves. For example, infanticide was primarily a woman's crime, and something like poaching was primarily a man's crime. Typically, pre the Industrial Revolution, although married women were the primary carer of children and their husband, they worked with their families on the land where they lived. After the Industrial Revolution, men would often travel to their place of work, leaving their wives in sole charge at home. As wages were often barely at a subsistence level, many women would take work into their homes in addition to their domestic duties, which sometimes included growing food and raising animals. Privacy was non-existent for the poor, with crowded houses and neighbourhoods. The authorities encouraged people to report on their neighbours, and local communities became judge and jury for some moral crimes. Women who lived alone and without family support were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, and these often came from other women in the community. Wealthy women's property would automatically transfer to their husbands when they married. We will journey through the parts of Dacorum's history that tie in with issues affecting women. We won't touch on every aspect of the history of women in Britain, but will focus on those which are connected with records of the treatment of women who have connections with the area. We will start with a discussion of women in the 18th century through the lens of the criminal justice system, using records of women from Dacorum, or sometimes the wider Hertfordshire area, some of which you may have heard if you've seen the witch hunting or brutal justice talks from the Heritage Trust. We will then move on to women in Dacorum whose stories have been recorded as part of English history, often through their association with some of Dacorum's historic houses. One of the areas of crime where we see the most records was violent crime, primarily murder. Murder covered things like infanticide, manslaughter, which was defined as unlawful killing without premeditation, murder, which was thought of as premeditated or deliberate killing, petty treason, which was defined by the Treason Act of 1351 as the killing of a master by a servant, a husband by his wife, or an ecclesiastical superior by his inferior. There were recognised differences between more and less abhorrent forms of murder, and key to these distinctions were the degree of malice and premeditation involved. If something occurred in hot or cold blood, for example, both the suddenness and the hotness of blood served to mark some killings as less heinous than others. The humoral system of health used at the time saw men as being hot and women cold, heat being the most valued attribute. Men overall outnumbered women among those convicted of homicide, in a ratio of 80 to 20%. Whilst women in early modern England killed far fewer people than did men, their very nature was thought to make them more susceptible to committing the kinds of killings deemed premeditated acts of murder, rather than the less serious crime of manslaughter. There were some important gender differences. As I mentioned earlier, women are more likely to be responsible for the killing of children. Men killers tended to use weapons like knives, swords, daggers and so on, whereas women tended to use their bare hands, things like kicking and strangling, suffocation, drowning and poison. Women, often older and poor, made up 80% of those accused of witchcraft. Husbands and children of those accused could also find themselves in the dock. Many were accused by neighbours, usually other women, sometimes just because they had a grudge against them. There were various methods adopted to ascertain the guilt of these women. One of the most well-known ones was trial by swimming. As witches were believed to reject baptism, the logic was that water would reject them and that they would float. Only the innocent would sink. Another method was trial by prayer. Witches were thought incapable of saying scriptures aloud, so the accused were made to recite prayers, and any mistakes were viewed as proof that they were in league with the devil. There were touch or incantation tests. If the accused's touch or incantations brought a cursed person out of a fit, they were found guilty of having laid the curse in the first place. Many fake victims acted this out successfully to prove the suspect guilty. The final method was looking for witches' marks. Witch hunters looked for the devil's mark, which was an area of the skin impervious to feeling, or extra nipples, which they were supposed to feed their familiars with. Suspects were stripped and any mark was interpreted as however the accuser saw fit. Sometimes suspects would be pricked with sharp knives all over their bodies to find an invisible devil's mark. The Witchcraft Act of 1736 stated that to believe in witches was irreligious and therefore forbade witch hunting as an activity. But belief in magic and witches was so ingrained in the psyche of the community that consultation of wise women and witches continued for a long time after, and witch denunciations therefore continued in communities. One well-known example that involved witch hunting took place in Tring and Hemel in 1751. This meant it was after the 1736 Witchcraft Act, when witch hunting became illegal. A woman called Ruth Osborne and her husband John, both over 70, were accused of witchcraft by their neighbours, specifically for cursing a Gubblecut farmer for refusing her some buttermilk. His animals died not long after, and he developed epilepsy. The community wanted revenge. Notices were put up in Winslow and Hemel that witches were to be tried by ducking at Long Marston Pool on the 22nd of April 1751. A mob gathered in Tring and found the couple who had been hidden by the authorities. The Osbornes were then stripped, their hands tied to their toes, and they were thrown into Long Marston Pond. Ruth died from the ducking. At the execution of the mob's ringleader, Thomas Coley, the crowd were angered that a good man was being executed for ridding them of an evil witch, in their view. Some punishments were harder on women, either because the crime was one that tended to be committed by women due to poverty and sexist social culture they lived within, or because the law prescribed tougher punishments for women than men for the same crime. One example of this was the area of domestic homicide. As I mentioned earlier, husbands and fathers were imbued with natural authority over their wives, children, and servants. The idea was that a well-ordered household was equal to a well-ordered state. The government of the household legitimised the use of correction and discipline. In Essex, 1560 to 1709, there were 431 homicides, of which 14% involved family members and 24% apprentices and servants. A husband guilty of murdering his wife could be hanged. However, a wife guilty of murdering her husband was considered guilty of treason, and her punishment was greater. Often she was burnt at the stake. Another area where women suffered a lot more than men from the arm of the law was infanticide. The average age of marriage was 24 to 26 years old for women in the 18th century. Therefore, premarital sex was common, and probably more common than the authorities liked to think. Unmarried mothers were thought of as fornicators and their children as bastards. This perspective continued in the public sphere right up into the 20th century. An article in 1953 in the Daily Mirror publishes replies to a reader's letter asking for improved status for unmarried mothers, but one of the letters stated that unmarried mothers should never have status to serve as warnings for young girls. Illegitimacy was looked down on in the early modern period, and this, combined with the poverty associated with single parenthood and the lack of support from family, meant that infanticide was a sad but frequent part of life for the poorer classes in the early modern period, with people sometimes pretending a child was stillborn, or even hiding the pregnancy and keeping the birth secret. However, although the government didn't support illegitimacy, it also came down very hard on cases of suspected infanticide, and the death penalty was the common punishment when detected. The lack of privacy I mentioned earlier from one's neighbours and the encouragement received by the community to watch each other for immoral behaviours in the early modern period meant that discovered infanticides were often those reported by neighbours. Considered to be one of the most heinous offences, infanticide law of 1624 made concealment of stillbirth a crime. Early 18th century commentator Joseph Addison called those guilty of the crime monsters of inhumanity. The law worked against the interests of unmarried women, and until 1803, guilt was assumed. Infanticide should not be entirely equated with murder. It was very difficult for single mothers. Abortion was difficult, dangerous, and illegal, and contraception almost non-existent. In some ways, infanticide was a crime that was forced upon women. Punishing people in public was considered to either enable them to pay penance and then return back into the community, or to act as a deterrent for others. Some of these public punishments were for behaviours that undermined men in the community. One of the most common ones that you might have heard of was ducking. Before 1550 it was used for trade crimes, but other than that it was used mainly for prostitutes and cheats, and by the 1600s was used for something called scolding, which was often what noticeable nagging women were accused of. Scolds, bridles or branks, as you can see in this picture, were also used as a device for punishing scolds and gossips and slanderers in the 16th and 17th century, especially in Scotland, and of course they were mainly used on women. Another common public punishment was whipping, and that was for the same sort of crimes. There's an example in the Hertford Quarter Sessions of 1647 of a lady called Helen Styles, who was found to be, and I quote, a very lewd and public strumpet, to be whipped in the public market at Hertford and kept to hard labour in the House of Correction for a month, and not to be delivered until she finds sureties. Occasionally there were ways to evade the death penalty. One of these ways, in the 17th and 18th century, was called the benefit of the clergy. Originally meant for the clergy to ask to be tried by ecclesiastical rather than civil courts, it then evolved to allow anybody who could demonstrate that they could read the Bible to evade the death penalty. This did disadvantage women. In reality, it meant that first-time offenders could obtain partial clemency for some crimes. Women did acquire the benefit of the clergy in 1624, although it was not until 1691 that they were given equal privileges with men in this matter. For example, before 1691, women could plead the benefit of the clergy if convicted of theft of goods valued at less than 10 shillings, whilst men could plead the clergy for thefts up to 40 shillings. There was one way of avoiding the death penalty that women could use that men couldn't, and this was called the benefit of the belly or womb, if she was pregnant. She had to endure a humiliating semi-public inspection by several people, including clergy and midwives, to demonstrate that she was pregnant. It was accepted by the ruling classes that communities would sometimes take justice into their own hands when moral codes had been broken. Sometimes called skimmingtons or riding the stang, unruly mobs would descend on someone who they felt had transgressed, and they would then publicly humiliate them. Most of these shaming rituals were to punish men who were perceived as not controlling their wives or family. They were often publicly humiliated for things like their wives' infidelity or adultery, or those who had been beaten by their wives. In the 18th century, women's reputations could be severely damaged, even though they were innocent victims. One of the most extreme cases of moral crime took place in Hemel Hempstead. On the 27th of August in 1753, Job Wells was hanged in Hertford for the incestuous armed rape of his 16-year-old daughter Maria in their home in Hemel Hempstead, whilst threatening her with a knife. Poor Maria had to give detailed evidence against her father in public court. The public nature of the trial would have affected her reputation for life. Furthermore, rape itself was not reliably punished by execution, if at all. However, the incestuous nature of this rape, in this case, meant that Job felt the full force of the law and he was executed. Shockingly, by modern-day standards, the Old Bailey stated in 1678 that it was against the law to have carnal knowledge of any female child under 10 years of age, so over 10 wasn't considered so criminal. So we're now going to move on to talk about some specific women in history of Dacorum. Berkhamsted Castle and King's Langley Palace and Ashridge House have housed many queens and nobility of England. The origins of Berkhamsted Castle are closely associated with the Norman conquest of 1066, but little is known of the settlement that existed here prior to Norman rule. An ancient document from the 10th century offers some clues to the significance of Berkhamsted in Saxon England. Ælgifu, who died in 970 AD, was the queen consort of King Edwig of England, who reigned between 955 and 959. The earliest written reference to Berkhamsted is to be found in the will of Queen Aelgifu, now held in the British Library. In this document, Ælgifu bequeathed large estates in 5 counties, including the manor of Berkhamsted. The fact that Berkhamsted had royal connections before the Norman conquest may perhaps be another reason why the English nobles chose Berkhamsted as the location for the surrender to William, Duke of Normandy, in early December 1066. Queen Eleanor of Castile was the much-loved first wife of Edward I. The manor of Chiltern Langley, or Langley Chenduit, came into royal hands first when Queen Eleanor acquired the site in 1276. The original manor is thought to have been near the church, but in 1278 there is a mention of a new start. It is surmised that this was the date when the palace at the top of the hill was started. The right-angle turn of the road at the top of Langley Hill marks where the road ran straight into the manor through the Court Gate. The south boundary of Rudolf Steiner School ground marks approximately the boundary between the palace and park, and rough foundations of a wall were found in 1963, showing that the eastern edge of the outer court ran about 10 feet to the east of the hall and classrooms. Between the years 1279 and 1281, a great deal of building work was done, as well as a new garden being planted with the vines. The Queen, who died in 1290, has been credited with the introduction of carpets and baths. The account of 1291 to 1292 shows money being used to embellish the buildings by the Queen. The hall was painted and decorated with 54 shields and a picture of 4 knights seeking a tournament. The Queen died unexpectedly. The next royal woman that appears in the records was Margaret of France. She was born in 1279 and died in 1318, and she was Queen of England as the second wife of King Edward, and Berkhamsted Castle was gifted as one of her dower lands. Many who fell under the king's wrath were saved from too stern a punishment by the Queen's influence over her husband, and the statement, "Pardoned solely on the intercession of our dearest consort, Queen Margaret of England," appears in some documents. In 1305, the young Queen acted as a mediator between her stepson and husband, reconciling the heir to his aging father and calming her husband's wrath. She favoured the Franciscan order and was a benefactress of a new foundation at Newgate. Margaret employed the minstrel Guy de Saltery, and both she and her husband liked to play chess. She and her stepson, the future King Edward II, who was only 2 years younger than she, also became fond of each other. He once made her a gift of an expensive ruby and gold ring, and she on one occasion rescued many of the prince's friends from the wrath of the king. The apparently mismatched couple were blissfully happy. When her sister Blanche died in 1305, Edward ordered all the court to go into mourning to please his queen. He had realised the wife he gained was a pearl of great price, as Margaret was respected for her beauty, virtue, and piety. The same year Margaret gave birth to a girl, Eleanor, named in honour of Edward's first wife, a choice which surprised many and showed Margaret's unjealous nature. Moving on in time to 1361, the Black Prince, also called Edward, married his cousin Joan, Countess of Kent, which was her third marriage. Because they were related, they had to obtain special permission for their marriage from the Pope Innocent VI. The wedding took place at Windsor Castle in the presence of King Edward III, and the couple honeymooned at Berkhamsted Castle. The extensive deer park behind the castle was a favourite hunting ground for the prince. There's a quote in records written at the time that says, "What a gay and rather costly doings, for Joan, it must be said, was a lady who loved such doings. They went on at their palace in Berkhamsted, what ridings and joustings and laughing and love-making." When Edward died, their son Richard II came to the throne. As the king's mother, Joan did exercise much influence behind the scenes, and was recognised as doing such during the early years of her son's reign. She also enjoyed a certain prestige and dignity among the people as an elderly royal dowager. For example, in 1381, on her return to London via Wickhamborough Estate in Kent, from a pilgrimage to Thomas Becket's shrine at Canterbury Cathedral, she found her way barred by Wat Tyler and his mob of rebels on Blackheath. However, she was not only let through unharmed, but was saluted with kisses and provided with an escort for the rest of her journey. Joan was in fact buried beside her first husband, as requested in her will, at the Grey Friars in Stamford, Lincolnshire. The Black Prince had built a chantry chapel for her in the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral in Kent, where he himself was buried, with ceiling bosses sculpting with the likeness of her face. Another boss in the north nave iron is also said to show her face. The next of the procession of royal women associated with Dacorum was Isabel of Castile. Langley was also a favourite residence of Edward III, who used it as his seat of government during the Black Death. His fourth surviving son, Edmund de Langley, was born here in 1341, and the occasion was marked by a tournament. He became the first Duke of York. The three children of Edmund and his wife, Isabel of Castile, spent many years at King's Langley. The daughter, Constance, was known as the White Rose of Langley. Edmund and his wife were first to be buried at the friary next to their palace home. Later, their rich tomb was moved to the Church of All Saints in the centre of the village, where it still stands. Crossing over a little with Sicily was Joan of Navarre, although she did die quite a while before Sicily. Henry IV granted Langley Manor to his second wife, Joan, and she continued to live there until her death in 1437, even though in 1431 the palace was damaged by fire. It was recorded that this was through the negligence and drowsiness of a minstrel and insufficient care of a lighted candle. As we'll see a bit later, 3 of Henry VIII's wives were granted the palace, but none lived in it, and the buildings then fell into decay. As I mentioned, Henry VIII conferred Langley Palace on 3 of his wives. The first one was Catherine of Aragon, which he gave her when he was about to marry her. The closest she actually ended up living to Langley Palace was Hatfield House. After being banished from court by Henry, she lived out the remainder of her life at Kimbolton Castle and died there in 1536. The English people held Catherine in high esteem, and her death set off tremendous mourning. An author, Juan Louis Vive, wrote a book called The Education of a Christian Woman, which was controversial when it was released for promoting that women have the right to an education. She commissioned the book, and it was dedicated to her in 1523. Such was Catherine's impression on people that even her enemy Thomas Cromwell said of her, if not for her sex, she could have defied all the heroes of history. She successfully appealed for the lives of the rebels involved in the evil May Day for the sake of their families. Catherine also won widespread admiration by starting an extensive programme for the relief of the poor. She was a patron of Renaissance humanism and a friend of the great scholars Erasmus of Rotterdam and Thomas More. In 1513, Henry made her regent when he went to war, and Catherine rode north in full armour to address the troops, despite being heavily pregnant at the time. She sent a letter to Henry along with a piece of the bloodied coat of King James IV of Scotland, who died in the battle, for Henry to use as a banner at the siege of Tournai. As a teenager, she was treated very much as a pawn in the royal power game, firstly marrying Henry's brother Arthur, and then almost being married off to her father-in-law Henry VII, before politics secured her marriage to Henry VIII. Although she led a privileged life, she suffered some things in common with her subjects. She was a widow at 16 and is said to have had several miscarriages and up to 4 stillborn or short-lived births. The Langley estate was given to the Morrison family by Charles I in 1626 to add to their estate of Cassierbury in Hertfordshire. Ownership of Cassierbury remained in the Morrison family until after the heiress Lady Elizabeth Morrison married Arthur Capel, 1st Baron Haddon. He was a royalist officer condemned as a traitor during the English Civil War, and he was executed and buried in the Tower of London. In common with other members of the gentry, the Revolutionary Parliament had previously confiscated the family's lands. His family lived at Haddam until after his widow, Lady Elizabeth Capel, secured their return, soon after her husband's execution, on the grounds that they were her inheritance from her father, Sir Charles Morrison. During the dissolution of the monasteries, the Ashridge Priory was surrendered to Henry VIII, who eventually bequeathed the property to his daughter, Elizabeth. Elizabeth spent 8 years living at Ashridge, and it was here that she was arrested by her half-sister Mary in 1554 and taken to the Tower of London. The Ashridge estate remained in Crown hands until Elizabeth's death in 1603. Some of her education took place in Ashridge. By the time she was an adult, Elizabeth spoke 4 languages, French, Flemish, Italian and Spanish, and could write English, Latin, Italian and Greek. By the time her formal education ended in 1550, Elizabeth was one of the best educated women of her generation. Historians, however, have taken a more complicated view of Elizabeth. Her reign is famous for the defeat of the Armada, but she is often more regarded as cautious in her foreign policies. She offered very limited aid to foreign Protestants and failed to provide her commanders with the funds to make a difference abroad. Elizabeth established an English church that helped shape a national identity and remains in place today, but did not stop all practices of Catholic origin from the Church of England. Elizabeth believed that faith was personal and did not wish, as Francis Bacon put it, to make windows into men's hearts and secret thoughts. Though Elizabeth followed a largely defensive foreign policy, her reign raised England's status abroad. Under Elizabeth, the nation gained a new self-confidence and sense of sovereignty. Elizabeth was the first Tudor to recognise that a monarch ruled by popular consent. She therefore always worked with a parliament and advisers she could trust to tell her the truth, a style of government that her Stuart successors failed to follow to their cost. We have to fast forward a couple of hundred years to start finding records of specific women in Dacorum. Tring Park was owned by the Rothschild family from 1838 to 1945. Miriam Rothschild was born in 1908 and was brought up mainly at Tring Park and Waddesdon Manor. Her father had described about 500 new species of fleas, and her uncle, Lionel Walter Rothschild, had built a private natural history museum at Tring. Miriam Rothschild was a leading authority on fleas also. She was the first person to work out the flea's jumping mechanism. She also studied the flea's reproductive cycle and linked this in rabbits to the hormonal changes within the host. Her new naturalist book on parasitism, fleas, flakes and cuckoos was a huge success. The Rothschilds' collection of fleas, founded by her father Charles Rothschild, is now part of the Natural History Museum collection, and her catalogue of them is a masterwork. Rothschild was a member of the Oxford Genetics School during the 1960s, where she met the ecological geneticist E.B. Ford. She campaigned with Ford for the legalization of homosexuality. Rothschild was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1985 and was made a Dame in 2000. She received honorary doctorates from 8 universities, including Oxford and Cambridge. She gave the Roman Lecture for 1984-5 in Oxford. In 1986, the John Galway Foster Human Rights Trust was established, and in 2006 the name of the trust was expanded to the Miriam Rothschild and John Foster Human Rights Trust. This funds an annual lecture on human rights. Kathleen Annie Panonica Rothschild was Miriam's sister and was born in December 1913 in London, the youngest daughter of Charles Rothschild. She was born into a branch of the wealthiest family in the world at the time. Her paternal grandfather was Nathan Rothschild, the first Baron Rothschild. She was brought up mainly at Tring Park and Waddesdon Manor, like Miriam. She joined the Free French Army to fight against Nazi Germany during the World War II. She had refused to participate in the North African campaign, but she joined clandestinely to fight alongside her husband. The war imposed a suspension of her marital and family duties, but she managed to send her children from France to America, secretly moving across continents. She served as a decoder, an ambulance driver, and radio host for the Free French. At the close of the war, she was decorated as a lieutenant by the Allied armies. She later moved to New York and became a friend and patron of many prominent jazz musicians, hosting jam sessions in her hotel suite, often driving them in her Bentley when they needed a lift to performances, as well as sometimes helping them to pay rent, buy groceries, and making hospital visits. Although not a musician herself, she is sometimes referred to as the Bebop Baroness, or Jazz Baroness, because of her patronage of Thelonious Monk and Charlie Parker, amongst others. She used her inherited wealth to pay for the funerals and burial grounds for several jazz musician friends, including Bud Powell, Sonny Clark, and Coleman Hawkins. Although it's jumping forward a long way in time to talk about Hannah Mary Rothschild, I think it's worthwhile talking about her when you're talking about the rest of her family. Hannah Mary Rothschild was born in 1962 and is a British writer, businesswoman, philanthropist, and documentary filmmaker. She also serves on the boards of various organisations. In August 2015, she became the first female to chair the Board of Trustees of the National Gallery in London. After 11 years as a trustee and more than 4 as a chair, she stepped down to devote more time to her family's wide-ranging activities and to writing. Her grandfather Victor Rothschild, the 3rd Baron Rothschild, was Nika's brother and grew up at Tring Park and other of the family homes. The lives of women changed significantly during the First and Second World Wars. Many companies throughout Dacorum adapted to making special products during the Second World War. Brock's Fireworks, for example, made signal rockets, parachute flares, and Beverley lights. Bulstrode Farm near King's Langley grew sunflowers, the seeds of which were used to manufacture edible oils and margarines. Cooper's Sheep Dip factory in Berkhamsted developed anti-louse powder during the war. Thousands of women were drafted in to fill the gaps left by men called into the services. Dacorum also remained an important area for agriculture, producing foodstuffs to sustain the war. However, the gains made by women during the Second World War proved transitory, as women were demobilised from men's work to make way for the returning servicemen, as had happened following the First World War. However, unlike the 1920s, the late 1940s and 50s were periods of sustained economic growth. The post-war reconstruction effort made the need for an expanded labour force urgent. In the late 1940s, the government launched campaigns to encourage women to enter or stay in the labour market, and encouraged the migration of workers from former British colonies to fill the labour shortages. However, it wasn't just in the factories that women made a difference during the war. The British Women's Land Army was first set up in January 1917 for the First World War. At the start, Britain imported around 50% of its food requirements. So at the time when Germany successfully mounted a naval blockade in 1915, and coincidentally Britain's harvest failure of 1917 combined to make a very serious impact of Britain's food reserve. Left with just 3 weeks of food and facing the prospect of famine, the Board of Agriculture founded the Women's Land Army. Over 250,000 women volunteered to work the land. Land girls, as they were commonly known, worked in agriculture, forage or timber cutting. Appeals for women workers were made via recruitment posters and rallies. Demonstrations would be held all over Hertfordshire, including Hemel Hempstead, Berkhamsted, Tring, King's Langley and Apsley. A local woman called Morell Smith provided an insight into life as a Land Army girl during the First World War through a recent oral history interview that she's done. She worked on farms in Tring and was given no formal training, and later recalled that the work was all instinct. Commencing work at 5 a.m. daily, Morell's tasks were varied and included ploughing, looking after cattle, milking, feeding farm animals, and looking after the farm's accounts. She recalled that one enticing aspect of the Women's Land Army was the uniform, specifically the wearing of breeches, which at the time was positively revolutionary. As part of her uniform, she wore a pair of leather Land Army boots, which came above the calf leg, and also wore a waterproof coat. She recollected how the sight of a woman in uniform provoked much interest among the locals, and humorously recalled how all the heads would be round the doors, trying to catch a glimpse of her. She delivered milk to most of Tring with a horse-drawn cart, and after her day's work she volunteered at a local canteen for 2 hours each evening, serving meals to local men on leave from the front. In recognition of her service, she was awarded the Order of the Red Triangle by the YMCA. Despite the hardships of the work, which a speaker at a Women's Land Army rally in Berkhamsted told the audience would provide every woman with corns on their hands, it was also a time of liberation, a taste of independence. The Land Army was reformed in June 1939 in preparation for World War II. Over 200,000 land girls worked from June 1913 until November 1950, replacing male farm workers who had gone to war. Coming from all walks of life, land girls were critical to increasing the country's food production. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that records of women in decorum through history are very sparse. And if you're looking for records of history and black women in decorum, I'm afraid the records are even less available. Black women were a part of the social landscape of the 18th and 19th century Britain, with varied social identities. Historians agree that black demographics throughout England in the 18th century ranged from about 10 to 20,000 people. Judging by the ratio seen in slave transportation, the largest movement of black people in this period, black women were outnumbered by men 2 to 1. Using this data, it can be assumed that the number of black women in Britain were about 5,000 upwards. Some were property owners, wives and traders, but many were servants and some were prostitutes. Mary Prince was a Bermuda-born, London-based woman who wrote the first account of the life of a black woman to be published in the United Kingdom. Many people were brought from Africa and the Caribbean to live on Hertfordshire estates, initially as servants, and although records are sparse, details can sometimes be found on birth, marriage and death records of the parishes. For example, there's a record of a Maria John, recorded as black, who's in the Berkhamsted baptism register on the 10th of May 1780. Similarly, a record of the marriage of Peter Stamford, who was described as black, and Sarah Webb in the Ashwell marriage register of 1721. From the 1950s onwards, due to the labour shortages following World War II, the UK government encouraged the immigration of migrant workers to rebuild Britain and service the newly created NHS. Whilst more men than women migrated in the earlier years, from the late 1960s there were significant numbers of women who migrated to join their families settled in the UK. Many of these women worked in the health service, but like women from all ethnic backgrounds, were more likely than men to be engaged in repetitive jobs which were poorly paid and had little prospect of promotion. Trade unions initially colluded with white workers, which meant that migrant women workers were disadvantaged in the labour market, both because they were women and also because they were immigrants. In 1978, the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent emerged as an umbrella group for the national network of black women's groups that had emerged after the National Women's Liberation Conference in Oxford in 1970. And the following year, they convened the first National Black Women's Conference held in Brixton that was attended by over 300 women. Most of the key activists, like Gerlin Bean, Olive Morris, Liz Obi, Beverly Bryan, and Zainab Abbas, lived and operated in London, but they often took their talks on the road around Britain, and their influence would have been felt in decorum as time went on.